Welcome to today's live stream. I'm going to get the stream started in a minute. I just have to let everybody know that the live stream is going on right now. So get ready to get started in a minute. Just going to do some promotion. You're welcome, on board. Glad to give you some great guys, great content. Well, today's live stream, I'm going to be talking about the fall of Vertigo Comics. Now, yet last night I read an article talking about Vertigo possibly shutting down. Now, these are rumors and have not been substantiated, but according to several sources, your Bleeding Cool, your Bounding into Comics, they are stating that the Vertigo imprint is going to be shut down. And it's really sad to see a great imprint like Vertigo Comics go out the way it's going out because at one time, Vertigo Comics was one of the most innovative imprints in the entire comic book industry. And when Vertigo Comics started in 1993, it was designed to be an imprint where creators could really explore different genres in the comic book medium and they could explore different types of stories in the comic book medium without the restrictions of the comic book code. And that's what made Vertigo Comics one of the big destinations for comics was the fact that when it came down to the content, you were going to get something other than superheroes. And when it came down to Vertigo, it was a great place for creators to come into because they could explore darker material, more unique material, and unique concepts. And they had a lot more creative control because when it came down to Vertigo Comics, you were not restricted by the comics code. And when it came down to Vertigo financially, it was also beneficial for a lot of creators out there because they could bring creator owned properties to Vertigo and have them distributed through DC Comics and maintain all of their rights. And as Vertigo started in 1993 with some DC characters like Constantine, Shade the Changing Man, the Doom Patrol, it had a very solid base of DC superhero characters that they could explore. And they could also go in and explore other unique concepts like Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. And all of these books allowed DC Comics through the Vertigo imprint to explore more adult content and reach older readers of comic books and reach older readers who were interested in comic books. Because when it came down to most comics and the industry before Vertigo, usually you had two groups. You had the Marvel DC superhero crowd, And then you had the indie crowd, and I think there was a third one, which was the kiddie crowd, which usually read the Archies and the Star comics. And when it came down to Vertigo, it really opened the door for many of the people who bought a lot of the indie books like Love and Rockets and many of the Fantagraphics titles to come in and start buying a lot of the DC Vertigo books in the 90s. And when it came down to Vertigo in the 90s, it really opened the door creatively in the comic book medium. We got all sorts of very diverse stories as related to the Vertigo imprint. I mean, the Vertigo imprint gave us many iconic books like Why the Last Man. It gave us books like Preacher. It gave us a lot of books like Tom Strong, which really gave us a really fun and unique look at the entire superhero genre. We got Promethea. So many great books and so many great creators got their start over at Vertigo and becoming stars. People like Warren Ellis, people like Garth Ennis, people like Chris Sprouse took their careers to the next level. And that was all done at the Vertigo imprint, where people were allowed that opportunity to really get creative and really take their concepts to another level, because Vertigo really was like a place where you could, when it came down to comics, you could really get creative and really explore those genres of comics that had been ignored for many years, like mystery with Sandman Mystery Theater, or you could explore things as related to horror, or you could explore concepts as related to science fiction. You could do all of that through that Vertigo imprint. And that Vertigo imprint, under the leadership of Karen Berger, turned into one of the strongest divisions at DC Comics, because when you look at Vertigo under Karen Berger, she really did a great job of having that vision for the Vertigo imprint. And she had the direction, she could set a direction for that imprint and making sure that all the titles really synergized with each other, and making sure that there were audiences for each of those titles. Oh, I didn't know that about Hardcore H, about Tom Strong. I'd heard that it was part of Vertigo, but it was one of those books that it was really strong at DC, but it wasn't really, I thought it was part of Vertigo because everybody talks about it's from Vertigo. I thought it was from there, but they always had really good titles over at Vertigo. And when I look at what happened to Vertigo after your Dan Didio got in charge of DC, it was really, really disturbing, because this was one of the stronger imprints at DC. And when he came in charge, all of a sudden they wanted to change things up. Warner executives, they wanted more control over Vertigo, because a lot of the Vertigo properties, what was going on, they were being turned into movies and TV shows, and they wanted to get control over the rights of those Vertigo properties. And because these people were so greedy and they didn't want to negotiate a deal with the creators who own their property, they wanted to change the deal. And that's what led to so many creators leaving Vertigo, and then eventually Karen Berger leaving Vertigo. And what happened after that was the Vertigo brand went into serious decline. And it went into decline because your DC's and Warner executives, they just didn't understand what made Vertigo special was the fact that you had these creator-owned properties, and these creators, they were giving us unique stories because they had an incentive to give you unique stories, because the deal was they would go out here and create these stories. They would get a cut of the money as related to the properties they created, and they would get to own their intellectual property. And when it came down to that intellectual property was worth a lot more to them than what your DC and Warner would have gotten in a work for hire deal. Now, usually when it comes down to comic books, it is usually a work for hire deal. And when you have a work for hire deal, what happens is any work that you create is owned by the company, and you get absolutely no compensation whatsoever for that property. And because you get no compensation for that property, what happens is, in most cases, this is why so many artists back in the day were poor and destitute, because they would do this work for hire deal. The company would make millions of dollars on the characters they would create, and the creator wouldn't get anything for it. And and today's creators, they look at that deal as a raw deal, and it gave them no incentive to continue trying to have a working business relationship with Vertigo Comics. And this is why we saw many of the top creators walking away from the Vertigo imprint, because when they looked at that deal, they said, no, we're not going to go with that deal. And as a publisher, and a writer, I can honestly say it was a very smart thing to do, because when a company is not going to give you any sort of deal as related to royalties or intellectual property rights as related to things like film, television, movies, things that can literally turn into $1 million deals if these properties go out here and become successful, it's just not a good deal for a comics creator to get into. So a lot of those creators left to go to either competing companies like Marvel, or they went out here or Image, or they just decided to go out here and start their own stuff and make their own money. Because when you own the property, then you can go out here and license your intellectual property to make more money on it. So if you own the intellectual property, for example, I own the rights to Isis, John Haynes, and Easting. So if somebody were to come to me and say, we want to, buy the television rights, I can sell those rights separately. And if toy company came to me and said, I want to buy the merchandising rights, I own all the rights. So I can go and sell the rights to the television in America. I can sell the rights to foreign, and I can also sell like merchandising rights on T-shirts, action figures, and I can sell not only the merchandising rights, but I can also sell in different scales. So I can go out here and, go from a 6-inch scale figure to a 12-inch scale figure to a 3 3/4-inch scale figure, and I can make all those deals with different companies, and I can make myself very, very rich just by licensing those properties out. And that's something that most comic creators and most writers like myself and publishers know. So what they wanted to do over at Warner Brothers is they were being greedy, and they wanted to be able to get these intellectual property over at Vertigo because it was becoming hot properties, and they wanted to get it in-house, and they wanted to keep those rights. But when it came down to today's modern creators, that type of deal just does not work. I mean, in today's publishing world, if you're not willing to be flexible on rights, then people aren't looking to make a deal. And when it comes down to the comic book industry, they just aren't very smart as related to licensing rights and intellectual properties. And this is why it is really hard to get new talent to come into the comic book industry these days and work for the big two. When it comes down to the big two, yes, people love the characters, but what they don't like from a business perspective is the deals that are out here and the fact that they cannot get compensation as related to that licensing and merchandising. And this is one of the things that, again, drove all the talent out of Vertigo and left the Vertigo brand in limbo around 2010, and when things got really messed up. And then you had Karen Berger, the leader and the visionary of Vertigo. She left, and ever since then, the Vertigo brand has been in complete limbo. Now, back in 2018, with the 25th anniversary of Vertigo Comics, it looked like they were getting ready to do a relaunch. Unfortunately, when it came down to this relaunch, there really wasn't much of a vision as related to it. Now, as I've read, they went out here and I believe they got some website blogger to be the editor, I think he was comics, one of these comic book websites. And they hired this guy to be the head of Vertigo and the senior editor of Vertigo. And while he was good at running a comics website, he really was not a publisher. And when it comes down to a publishing imprint, you really need someone with publishing experience to go out here and run that brand. And the reason why you need somebody with publishing experience to run that brand is because somebody with publishing experience understands that in order to have a publishing imprint, one, you need to have a vision, which is a 3 to 5 year plan for where you want the imprint to be. And two, you need to have a mission. And the mission of a publisher is the statement that sets the direction for that imprint and the types of books it's going to publish. For example, with the SJS Direct imprint, my mission was to create positive stories about the African American experience and to create books that would give you a diversity of the Black experience and make efforts to diversify the Black book market. So when it comes down to my imprint, I'm doing positive stories, and I'm also doing stories about diverse experiences in the Black community. I'm talking about things like African American fantasy, science fiction, and even talking about other subcultures like Black people in the goth subculture. So I'm focusing on my mission, and because I have a mission, I can then set together a theme as related to the books that are going to be published. So if I've got that mission and I've got that plan, that mission, I can sit there and I know what type of books I want to publish, what audience I'm targeting with those books, and I can set a direction as the vision for 3 to 5 years. And we did not get to see that with the Vertigo relaunch because this blogger, he knew about the internet and he knew about generating internet controversy, but he didn't understand the foundations of establishing a publishing imprint. And he didn't understand that you have to have books in that imprint that fit that mission. Now, Karen Berger, she understood this, and she understood that the original mission of Vertigo was supposed to be a place for comics that did not fit the comics code. And it was a place where creators could go out here and explore those concepts outside of the comics code, explore those genres that weren't a part of the comics code, like crime stories, like horror stories, and those darker superhero stories. So she had a real good understanding of the comic book business, and she had a good understanding of how to run a publishing house. But this new guy, he didn't really have a good understanding of how to run a publishing business, and he wanted to try to use the Vertigo imprint as a place to promote identity politics. And with that, he went out here and hired a lot of grossly unqualified individuals to work at Vertigo. And that was a huge mistake because when you're launching a publishing imprint, the first year of running that imprint is one of the roughest years for an imprint, because when you're running a publishing imprint in the first year, that's when you're going to take on major losses. And the reason why you're going to take on major losses in the first year is because nobody really knows who you are and nobody really cares who you are. And you have to give the customer a reason to go out here and buy your products. And with the new Vertigo imprint, it was already starting out with a bad word of mouth because people had heard that it was a so-called SJW imprint, and they had heard many of the titles really weren't the kind of titles that would really appeal to any audience. Because when you take a look at the titles for many of the new Vertigo books, they really weren't something that grabbed people and would give you incentive to go out here and buy these comics. I mean, comics like Border Town, Hex Wives, High Level, these were not really titles that, and Goddess Mode, they really were not compelling titles. They really were not the type of titles that really would get a reader's attention and give them that reason to really go out and buy them. I mean, I looked at many of the covers of these books when I was reading them, and I said, this is not a comic that really, if I saw it in the comic shop, I would have a reason to really go out here and pick it up. It just was not really something that was compelling, and it just didn't really grab me. Most of these so-called SJW creators who worked at the new Vertigo, they were more interested in being social media superstars than actually going out here and developing the kind of stories that would get people's attention. And they would do things to get people agitated on social media, but they weren't thinking about getting those sales up. Now, as I was working on the SJS Direct imprint, and I started it in 2009, the first thing I was thinking about out the gate was sales, because I understood after I published ISIS in 2002 and Cassandra Cookbook in 2008, you really have to focus on getting strong sales. And this is something that every writer in the trade markets, we understand that with 90% of books all failing, you really have to come out of the gate very strong if you want to get sales. And you have to be able to focus on those sales, because that's how the imprint grows. Now, when it came down to the original Vertigo, they did start out with some titles to really get your attention: Sandman, Swamp Thing, and books like Shade the Changing Man and Constantine. And those were what we call foundation books. And those are the books that laid the foundation to get people to come into the Vertigo imprint and then try out other titles as they go along. If they like the Sandmans, the Constantines, the Doom Patrols, the Shades, who were part of the DC universe, and they feel safe with those books, then what they do is then try other titles because they see those books actually being of quality and then want to go out here and take risks on other books. So I understood what Karen Berger was doing with Vertigo. But the new people in charge, they really did not understand how the publishing business worked. And they didn't understand that you needed that core foundation to get the customers in. And then you can come in with newer titles. They just came in with a lot of these so-called SJW books. And then they came in with a bunch of grossly unqualified talent. And these people came in and they launched a bunch of books blind, which is something no publisher ever wants to do. You never really want to launch a book blind, because if you launch a book blind, then it makes it tougher to sell. In order to really sell a book, you really need to have this book be connected to other books that sell. Then people have incentive to actually go out here and buy the other books in the imprint. So this was a mistake that they made at Vertigo. And again, it's because the guy had no publishing experience and he didn't really understand how the publishing industry worked. He was just coming in thinking that he could go into the web business that he did. He was running a comics website. He really couldn't run that very well. And he was going to try to run this Vertigo imprint on the same things that sell on the internet and things like controversy. But when it comes down to internet controversy does not lead to sales, because what leads to sales of books is word of mouth And online word of mouth about what's going on, the chatter on a message board, really does not churn into revenue. And that's something I know from personal experience publishing books, is that a lot of people, they may talk about a book online, but it's them, they're not, may not go out here and buy it. So when it comes down to your book, you have to make sure that what's on the page is strong, because if what's on the page is strong, then you're going to be able to go out here and sell books. And then we didn't see that with Vertigo. There was no real plan for how they were going to sell these books, and there was no real theme as related to the titles. Because if you look at the titles of many of these Vertigo books, there was no real synergy between the books. I mean, for example, with Milestone, when they launched Milestone back in '93, I believe, we at least saw the establishment of the Milestone universe with Hardware, Icon, Blood Syndicate, and Static. And all four of the books, they synergized together as they formed the Milestone universe. So you had an incentive to buy all the number ones. But with all of these new Vertigo books that were launched in 2018, there was no real synergy between your Border Town, your Hex Wives, your High Level, your American Carnage, and those books really didn't synergize together to really get people to come in and buy all of the other books. And that's something you need from a publisher's perspective. You really need to understand how to sell books. And the people who were running your Vertigo at the time, they didn't understand how to run books. They were more about promoting that identity politics in between the pages of their books, and they were more about being social media celebrities. And a social media celebrity is not something any author really wants to focus on, because a social media celebrity going out here and making all of these hostile statements, yes, it generates a lot of controversy and it gets a lot of people talking on Twitter, but that's not going to put money in your pocket in something as high risk as publishing. Because when it comes down to publishing, you are in a business where 90% of all the products fail, and you really have to come out of the gate strong with a really strong product that leaves a powerful first impression on people. And these social media celebrities at Vertigo, they were more interested in doing things to get people talking about them instead of going out here and talking about their books. For example, you had your Robbie Rodriguez, who was the artist on Goddess Mode, and he took a picture of his anus and then sent it to Ethan Van Sciver. And yes, that got Ethan Van Sciver and many of the Comicsgate people talking about him. And it may have gotten people like your Diversity in Comics going out here and buying his book and roasting it, but it didn't get him the sales he needed from those casual readers and those DC readers that they were trying to reach with the book. I mean, that type of thing, it led to a very controversial scandal, and it was really related, and it was extremely unprofessional. But at the end of the day, when you're publishing books, you need to have sales. And these stunts that they were participating in, these creators were participating in, yes, they got a lot of controversy on social media, but it just was not helping the Vertigo relaunch. I mean, people like Zoe Quinn going to social media to call Republicans evil, Ramon Villalobos talking about anti-white racism, Rob Sheridan attacking Donald Trump supporters. I mean, this is stuff that really it's not a good look for the Vertigo imprint, which is already was in limbo for a couple of years, and now making its comeback. It just does not give the public that good, strong first impression when you see creators acting a fool online, and you see creators being extremely unprofessional online. I mean, when you're out here as a creator, you really want to make sure that your image is something relatable, because this, as a new creator, nobody knows who you are, and you have to give those people a reason to care. Because if you don't give people a reason to care, then they're not going to want to go out here and buy that product. And that so-called SJW Comics pros, they were going out of their way to argue with people online, going into these anti-Trump rants. And that's something that is really detrimental for a new publishing imprint, and is something detrimental to people who are working in a medium like comic books, which is supposed to be all about an escape. Because when it came down to the old Vertigo imprint, it was not only an escape from the real world, it was also an escape in ways from the superhero genre. And it allowed people who were older to be able to come back to comics and come back to comic books that with stories that were a bit more mature, a bit more adult themed, and explored adult concepts and even different concepts. So when I look at what they did with the Vertigo relaunch, it was destined to be a disaster, because there was no real leadership as related to it, no real direction as related to it, and no real focus on where they wanted to go. They just hired a bunch of so-called SJW comics pros, put these books on the market like throwing crap on a wall, and expected this to be some sort of success. And you weren't going to get any sort of success, because anybody who has been in the publishing business, they can tell you that you're not going to get any sort of success by this business approach, because when it comes down to publishing, you really have to have that plan in place if you hope to get any sort of success. Now, these books that they launched, the Border Town, your Hex Wives, your High Level, they were not only terrible books, but they really shipped really low numbers on the first issue. Looking at the numbers, it's like they shipped anywhere from 17,000 to the start, and then the second issue dropped almost 50%. So when you have books shipping already low, and then the second issue shipping even lower, it's an indicator that the imprint really was not strong. And when it comes down to a comic publishing, yeah, the first issue is going to do strong, and the second may drop off a bit, but eventually by the third, you're going to start to see a little bit of momentum. And by the fifth or sixth, that's when you're going to start to see the numbers stabilizing, because that'll show you that the audience is there and that the audience is engaged in what you're doing. But when it came down to many of these Vertigo books, a lot of them, they left that really bad first impression with the bad storytelling, the bad art, and the stories that were really poor quality. And they all left an even worse impression when you had these creators who were just acting extremely unprofessional on social media. And a lot of this, again, is due to the complete lack of leadership under the new Vertigo imprint. There was no real leadership to come in here. Like, for example, with the case of your Robbie Reyes taking that picture of his anus, nobody came to that Robbie Reyes and checked him and let him know that, look, we have standards here at this Vertigo imprint for professionalism. We have standards for conduct. And if you want to be a part of this imprint, you need to follow those guidelines and rules as related to professionalism and conduct on social media. Because as an employee of this company, you represent this company, and your story, your comics represent this brand. So if you're not going to act professionally, then you should leave. But instead of doing that, we got people just getting a pass for all sorts of unprofessional behavior. And again, not only did these comic skaters get upset about this, but the general public also got upset about this. And usually you may not hear from the casual readers and the general public, but they are watching this behavior that people are participating in. They are watching the conduct people are participating in. And this is something that may give a person a reason to go out here and buy your books, or it may give them a reason not to buy your books. And that word of mouth can be the thing that winds up keep either making your book a bestseller or making it a complete failure. And when it came down to many of the Vertigo Comics pros in 2018, they really didn't get that course on related to doing business in publishing. When it came down to a lot of them, they were all in this woke mode, and they thought that because they had the right politics, they could publish whatever they wanted. And what they didn't understand is when it comes down to publishing, your job is to earn the customer's money. They thought they were entitled to the customer's money, and because they were so caught up in the attention they were getting from comic skaters roasting their books, they weren't really thinking about how this was impacting their overall sales numbers. They were more in their feelings about the attention they were getting, but not focused on the fact that these books weren't selling, and they weren't focused on a plan as related to social media and getting your books to sell. Because when you are on social media, you are a business, and as a business, you have to make efforts to go out here and sell your books. And we didn't see that with Vertigo 2018. And this is why Vertigo 2018 was in trouble from minute one. Now, as the Vertigo imprint went on with the first couple of books in its launch, we started to see some scandals start to arise, like the Robbie Reyes anus picture, which he directed towards Ethan Van Sciver. And we saw a scandal with Border Town writer Eric Esquivel. And it was alleged that your Border Town writer Eric Esquivel was involved in some sexual misconduct with a minor, and he denied these accusations. However, this misconduct, it put a real stain on the Vertigo imprint. And it was that scandal that led to the really poor quality Border Town comic being canceled, but it also put a real tarnish on the Vertigo imprint, because you have this individual who was on social media talking about social justice and doing what is right. And here he is caught in a scandal where he's out here participating in inappropriate sexual relationship with a minor, and that there's documented proof on social media that he's on showing this relationship. And this was something that it should have, again, been vetted by editorial before this man was even hired. They should have been vetted through background checks. And it showed, again, a complete lack of leadership as related to the Vertigo imprint. We did not see any sort of, again, when you don't have a mission or a vision, you don't vet the people who are a part of your imprint. And because you don't have that mission or that vision, what happens is this leads to things like this scandal going on. And it was this scandal that was, like, I saw it as the beginning of the end of Vertigo 2.0, because when it came down to that scandal, it put a lot of negative press as related in the comic book world towards the Vertigo imprint. Now, the second scandal that really did damage to the Vertigo imprint was the Second Coming comic book. Now, this Second Coming comic book, this was supposed to be a comic book about Jesus coming back to Earth, and he's supposed to be a bumbling, stumbling idiot who was supposed to be incapable of doing things. And then you're supposed to have this Sun Man he's supposed to be a roommate with. And this was a comic that was very controversial, and it was controversial for all the wrong reasons, because when it came down to this comic. It was getting attention, like many of the SJWs like to get, and like this editor like to get, the controversy, but it was not getting positive controversy. What was happening was people were getting controversial, and it was getting the attention of casual people, but many of those casual people were offended by the presentation of Jesus as coming back to earth and Jesus being presented as completely incompetent. And as this comics controversy was being generated, what happened was there was a petition being brought out, and this petition had over 200,000 signatures talking about a boycott of Warner Brothers. And this was not a good look for Warner Brothers' whole business, because Warner Brothers was getting ready to be sold to AT&T. And this whole thing with Second Coming, it was considered blasphemous by many Christians, because Jesus Christ, to many Christians, is the Son of God. And the promise of him returning to earth is something they consider to be sacred. And they consider the Son of God someone who needs to be respected and revered. So their attempt to try to publish the Second Coming book, this was really, it offended so many people, it wasn't funny. And in fact, those 200,000 signatures, what they represented was our audience far larger than the best-selling comic books at the DC Imprint, because at the time, Batman was barely selling about 100,000 copies, and you had 200,000 signatures. So you had an audience larger than your best-selling comic out there. And this audience that was larger than your best-selling comic, this one would have had a national impact on the entire DC brand. And after this comic, Second Coming, we saw your Dan Didio and people at DC scrambling to get this book stopped before it even went to print. And the reason why they went to stop it before it went to print is because it would have had major damage to the DC brand and major damage to the DC imprint. And what they wanted to do was just give the rights to Second Coming back to the creators, and they wanted to go out, give those rights back to those creators and move on. So what they did was something basic in publishing, something that was done as related to, I remember with Judith Regan and the O.J. Simpson book, If I Did It. The book had such bad press that they literally could not publish this O.J. Simpson If I Did It. So even though they had 500,000-600,000 copies of this book in print, they had to scrap all of those books because of all the negative backlash regarding O.J. Simpson telling the country that he did it. So that book wound up costing the publisher, I think it was HarperCollins, all that money in advance and in printing fees. And it led to the termination of Judith Regan over that publishing imprint, because what she did, because she had her own imprint, Regan Books, they literally had to shut the entire imprint down because of what she presented. And they wound up shutting it down because they just could not let the brand come back from that type of, complete destruction. They just couldn't come back from it. And that was something that could have been avoided, because anybody would have known back then with O.J. Simpson, he was a lightning rod. And yes, it would have generated a lot of controversy to have him write a book. But the whole thing is, but people were just trying to get over it and move on. But with this Vertigo, what they were doing with this Jesus book would have really destroyed DC's reputation, which was already on shaky ground. I mean, comic sales are at an all-time low. And this would have literally alienated an entire group of casual readers from buying comics, because this comic it was a blasphemous comic in the eyes of most Christians, and most of America and most of the buying audience for comics is primarily core Christian. So that book, it really would have done major damage. And they had another book, I think, that was sex related. That book never even went to print because the Time Warner considered that book to be considered obscene. So that book never even went to print. And with that launch, all of those books crashing and burning 100%, it showed that the Vertigo imprint was in bad shape. Because when you have a publishing imprint where almost all of your books fail and not one book comes to even generate any sales or generate any good word of mouth, what happens is your imprint it's in a bad place. So I understand why your AT&T and Time Warner are now making efforts to, if this is true, possibly shut down this Vertigo imprint, because the name has been tarnished. And when it comes down to the brand, there's not much anyone can do with the brand after you've had this incredibly bad relaunch with all of these incredibly bad titles, and you've had all of this press that's just been extremely negative. I'm glad to see you in the stream, Gabriel. I'm glad to see you here, Nightingale Wednesday night. Sup, dudes? Thoughts? I'm gonna go the chats. Glad to see you here, Dark Void, Terminator T800, Hardcore H. Glad to see you all here. Yeah, let's get the likes up. We're at 21 viewers. Can we get the likes up to at least 21? And yeah, there weren't enough. SJWs really don't buy books. So Dude's Thought, it's a good point, but they don't buy books. And they'll talk about these identity politics and these political positions, but it just doesn't sell books. And I know that because I sat down there and I read Hex Wives, I read High Level, and these books were filled with identity politics, but there was no story there to really compel you. I mean, you can sit there and read one issue and it didn't make you care. And if you spend $3 or $4 on one book, and it doesn't make you care, then you're not going to come back to pick up any more books. And this was one of the saddest things. Hey, Supremo, glad to see you here. That I saw with the Vertigo imprint is that there was no real care on the pages of those new Vertigo books. In the old Vertigo books, you could see the craftsmanship, you could see the love for comics, you could see the care for comics, and then you could see that these creators really appreciated the opportunity given to them to work with DC Comics and work on the DC imprint. And you could see that care, because when it came down to comics, you were very restricted due to the comics code in what you could say or what you could do. And many creators, they really appreciated that opportunity in the 90s with Vertigo to really be able to come out of that box and really just try to explore all these different genres, explore these different types of story models, and even explore, different art styles, so you could really get creative with it. And that was something that you never really saw with this new Vertigo. And Gabriel makes a good point. Yeah, without Karen Berger, we wouldn't have Vertigo, because she really was the visionary behind it. And DC didn't really understand how a visionary she was, because she really understood what Vertigo needed to be. She really understood what course needed to be set, and she really understood what direction that the brand needed to be set in. I mean, you have somebody who understood comics, understood what people were being restricted by with the comics code, and then understood what genres that needed to be explored. I mean, books like Sandman Mystery Theater, that really took us into the detective and crime genre, which really wasn't really explored ever since the days of the Comics Code, because the pre-Comics Code days, a lot of the content was really violent. And you had other books like Preacher, you had books like Lucifer, all these books, they really took us into concepts that weren't regularly tackled in the superhero genre and weren't regularly tackled in most mainstream books, and explored a lot of themes that weren't explored in mainstream books. So she really understood what the Comics Code restricted, and then gave us books that really showed us the greatness of comics and showed us how much more diversity of thought we could get as related to comics. And she really understood things, but when it came down to the people who were put in charge of DC, your Dan Didio's, your Jim Lee's, they really did not really understand things. I mean, Jim Lee, he's a great artist, and he's not really a businessman. And Dan Didio, he has no real understanding of publishing whatsoever. Now, under the two of them, DC has turned into a complete mess. And I believe that, yeah, that's one of the reasons why Karen Berger left Vertigo, because they didn't really understand the business, and they took the business in a bad direction. Them and Warner Brothers executives, who were so greedy, they were more about mining the Vertigo imprint for intellectual property rights, that they weren't thinking about going out here and understanding what gives a creator incentive to go out here and create property, because no creator these days is going to sign a bad deal where they either have all rights in the contract or have a clause saying that it's work for hire. Because when it comes down to many creators out here, we understand the value of that intellectual property, and we've seen many creators wind up not being able to take care of themselves in their old age, while their very popular characters are making millions of dollars for these multinational corporations. So most people who are in comics, they understand what the deal is, and they see it as a bad deal. And after I looked at one of the articles talking about the kind of contract they wanted comic creators to come in with the new Vertigo deal, that was a raw deal as related to creators. And it wasn't a good deal, because when it came down to Warner Brothers, they didn't want to negotiate deals on creator-owned properties. Instead, what they wanted to do was try to trick somebody into making property for them. And no creator worth their salt is going to spend time creating a character or a concept and just give it to you for free, watch you make a couple of $1 million on it, and then say that they're just grateful for the opportunity to work for you on a work for hire deal. Those days, those are over as related to the comic book business. And this is something that many in corporate don't understand. Yes, you might be able to get one of these SJWs to go take that type of deal, but most people who understand the business of publishing, they're going to be like, I would rather just go out here and publish my own stuff, or I'd rather work with an imprint where I can get a better deal. And these days, when it comes down to comic books, most comic book creators, they are going out here, and what they're doing is they are taking full ownership of their process, and they're going out here and owning their own properties and getting their properties funded, sometimes through these crowdfunding projects or through other means. That's what I want to do with the ISIS graphic novel, is I want to try to get it funded through Patreon. So if everybody could donate to the Patreon, I would really appreciate it. Because I'm trying to raise funds to pay for the first ISIS graphic novel, and that's something I'm trying to do. So I'm going to leave a link to that in the chat. And that's something I want to try to get funded, is the ISIS graphic novel. I mean, I tried to do an Indiegogo earlier this year, and even though it didn't work out, I'm still persevering, because it's something that I wanted to do ever since I was 9 years old. And when I look at the what people are doing right now, I'm seeing some really great comics coming out from independent creators, like with Raymond Leonard with Agent Solo. He made a really great comic which pays tribute to the 90s. Josh Howard, his T-Bird and Throttle is one of the best comics of 2019. And that #2 issue, it's a classic, and you definitely need to go pick that one up. I'm hoping to get some more independent comics from indie creators. I got Bill Walko's The Hero Business. That was a great comic. Lots of great comics out there. And sadly, they're not being produced at places like Vertigo, which used to take on unique concepts like that. But these days, we're not seeing the houses do it anymore, because the houses, sadly, are not run by really good, qualified, professional publishing professionals. And a lot of people, they take what a publishing pro as a job for granted, but we can see from the complete collapse of Vertigo what happens when you don't have a publishing professional in charge. When you don't have a publishing professional in charge, again, there's no person there to set a vision for the imprint, and then there's nobody there to make sure that the books fit within the mission of the imprint, because you definitely need that person in charge, that editor-in-chief, to really set that mission so that the books synergize together. And when the books synergize together, what happens is you're going to get people going from buying one book to the next book, and then all of the books, they are going to synergize in some way, shape, or form. So all the books, they are going to fit together, and you're going to see them fit together even though they have different styles. For example, with the ISIS series, you have ISIS, you have E-Steam, and then you have John Haynes. These are the 3 books of the SJS Direct 2019 catalog. They all fit within a theme. So they are all part of the same universe, and they all fit together. So when a reader picks up one book, they see that all the stories work together, and they see that all the elements work together in some way, shape, or form. They see that all the different characters work together, and that all of the themes all work together. And that's something you need when you're running a publishing imprint, is you need somebody who understands that you just can't put random books together and then expect people to go out here and just pick up a random book. Like, for example, with my readers, they know that Isis is the goddess next door and Easteme is the devilish diva, and they know that both of them are sisters, and because they're sisters, both books tie together. And with John Haynes is Easteme's girlfriend, and he is the character who is the flagship character, who is the foundation of the SJS Direct universe. So all the characters are connected through relationships with each other, and their stories connect them to a universe. So that's the thing that ties them together, and it gives readers an incentive to pick up all 3 of the books in the 2019 catalog, and then go back in the catalog to pick up the backstories and anticipate the future stories that are coming out. And that's something we didn't see at Vertigo. They just sat there and wanted to launch this imprint, but they wanted to launch it with no direction. Hey, Tyler Robinson, I'm glad to see you here. That's true, Bison for Life. They have not really embraced social media as a way to grow fans. And when it comes down to many in the comic book industry, they see social media as a platform for them to either be rock stars, or they see it as a platform for them to push their political agenda. Now, I see social media as a great tool for business, and I see it as a platform for growing the readership of the SJS Direct imprint. And that's one of the reasons why I'm out here and I'm doing things like live streams, because I want to be able to reach my readers and I want to grow my customer base. So that's one of the things that many of your so-called comic pros, they don't really understand about social media is that you have to go out here and use it as a tool. And they don't really understand that when you're on social media, it is the greatest tool for promoting your work, especially if you are a new writer and you are an unknown writer. And if you're not known and people don't know your product, you have to go out there and leave that strong first impression on your viewers and on your readers so that they'll go out here and pick up your work. And this is something that many of the comic pros who were a part of Vertigo 2.0 didn't understand. They just thought they could go on the social media and use it to go out here, make these Donald Trump rants, talk about Republicans, talk about all of these different things as related to social justice, or do things like your Robbie Rodriguez and take a picture of his anus. And this isn't the type of stuff that really gets you customers. You need, when you're in a business like publishing, where your customer base is high risk, you need to, again, come out there with that strong first impression that gets people excited. And they didn't do that. They just came in thinking that social justice will sell comics, but social justice doesn't sell comics. Social justice, it generates a lot of controversy, but controversy does not get people to open their wallets. When you have a product, what you want to do is give people reasons to go out here and buy books. And you really want to give people reasons to go out here and get excited about those books, because once they get excited, you're going to generate that word of mouth. And it's that word of mouth that's going to give people reason to go out here and buy books, because if their friends are saying this book is awesome, like when I did the Josh Howard, T-Bird and Throttle video, people are going to go out here and pick up more comics. Excuse me. They're not going to sit there and buy a comic from a guy who is making rants about Donald Trump, or going out here and making rants and starting arguments with people online, because a lot of people, they follow people on Twitter, and sometimes they're not even following you on Twitter. Some people lurk in the background for many, many months or many years, and I've had people do that for many years. And you have to go out here and really get people excited about your work, really get them into your work. And that's something that they didn't really do as related to Vertigo Comics. And it's a shame that this imprint is rumored to be getting shut down, because this was a imprint that opened a lot of doors for a lot of creators. It opened a lot of doors for the comic book industry, and it allowed the comic book industry to reach a new audience. And it's a shame that we're going to see one of the best imprints to ever come out of the Warner Brothers era DC go out this way, if this is the case, because this was, again, one of the crown jewels of comics. I mean, Vertigo, from a creative standpoint, it was a place where really a lot of great concepts came out of it. A lot of really great stories came out of it, and a lot of great creators came out of it. And a lot of creators could really open up their imaginations and really give us some really, really unique comics, and it could give us some unique art styles. And it really showed how great comics could be, that we could go out here and do different things with comics with the Vertigo imprint. And it's a shame to see this imprint die out the way that it did in a whimper, when it had such a bang on the overall comic book genre. So I look at it this way. It's like, it's one of those, it's the saddest thing to see, Vertigo go out like this, because people just did not appreciate how great this imprint was and how great the comics were. They didn't really appreciate what this imprint had to offer comic readers. They didn't really appreciate what it meant to the overall industry. They just didn't appreciate that. And it would be a real shame to see Vertigo go out the way it's rumored to be going out, that we're going to get this imprint shut down. And I believe the industry is going to suffer as a result of it, because there aren't that many places for really unique stories anymore. A lot of the companies that used to be about that, like Image used to be about, comics that weren't like like your traditional superhero Marvel DC, and you could have creative control. It's just not like that anymore. And I believe, sadly, the only way we're going to get really creative comics is outside of the traditional industry. And I believe that's why I say that the industry is going to be going more print on demand, and it's going to be a lot less, mainstream style distribution, and that we're going to be going to see this more and more creators making their own comics and then selling them directly. And sadly, the people at Warner Brothers couldn't see that was the direction that the industry was going in. They couldn't see that the industry, you're going to need to give creators more control, and you're going to have to give them more creative rights. And your Warner Brothers wanted to choke that out. And when they choked that out, they wound up choking out one of the few places where they could actually grow some fruit. Because when it comes down to comics, you definitely need to have a place where people can be creative. They can explore, different stories and different story models. Because yes, superheroes are fun, but you really, when it comes down to writers, you really can't really explore really different types of stories until you come out of superheroes sometimes. And sometimes you have concepts that don't really fit superheroes. So I look at it as a major loss if this is the case, that the Vertigo is going out. And I look at it as a major loss creatively, because when it comes down to comics, we really did need that type of place. And we've already lost milestone. I see it for the next 20, 25 years because of the lawsuit. And now we're losing Vertigo. So I really find it to be a quite troubling period. So Bison for Life, yeah. I know about the boutique comics. Yeah, they are kind of expensive, but some creators they have costs, and it's like when I was crunching the numbers for the All That Glitters graphic novel, it's expensive because when you're making a smaller run, those costs cost more. And when it comes down to comics, you have these fixed costs. Like the art is a fixed cost, the coloring is a fixed cost, the lettering is a fixed cost, and it's real expensive to put together a comic. And that's one of those things that when you crunch all the numbers, you need at least to put $25, $30 just to get that, indie book published on a small print run. And even with print on demand, cutting costs to maybe $2, $3 a copy on a small print run, what you're getting is cost per unit. And this is something that is a major part of why these boutique comics are expensive, is that it has to do with the labor costs involved, because you are controlling all of the labor costs. Now, some guys, they are trying to offset the cost of their art, because art, it takes a lot of hours to put together, 35 pages of a comic, or 40 pages of a comic, or 50 pages of a comic. And it takes more hours to do the lettering, do the coloring. All that stuff costs a lot of money. And when you have to outsource it, it's really expensive. I know when I was crunching the numbers for the ISIS graphic novel, I was trying to find some way to bring it lower, but there was no way to bring it lower. Even if I were to hire another artist, it was still going to cost the same thing, because a lot of these costs, they are fixed, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. So that's something I ran into, and it's something that there's no way of getting around it. So a lot of people think it's just, oh, this comic is $30, but this comic is $30 because it's part of a limited print run where we're probably going to make maybe under 1,000 copies. And once you go under 1,000 copies, it really gets expensive. And even with, yeah, and that's even with print on demand, because print on demand book, it can cost anywhere from maybe $2 a copy, but then you have to factor in, if you put it on Amazon, Amazon's cut, and then you have to factor in the discounts. So all of it can lead to a book costing a certain amount of money. And then you have to, then again, you have all those costs, and then you also have the fees from Indiegogo or Kickstarter. So that's all factored in. I did all that research, and yeah, it's expensive. Okay. I've heard about writers using artists from overseas, but the whole thing is I don't think that that's going to last for long, because a lot of these artists from overseas, they're starting to wake up. I remember one artist, he had an $80 page rate, and then he realized that he was getting ripped off, and then he started charging more. So a lot of artists, they're overseas, but a lot of them are saying that they're starting to figure it out, that they're not getting compensated fairly for their property by for life. That's why it's a way of cutting costs, but it's a way that's closing up, because a lot of guys are saying, look, if I'm going to do this many hours of labor, then I deserve to be compensated for it. And I have to agree with them. I mean, when it comes down to a piece like Bill Walko did for Esteemed Goddess of, with 2 figures and all that glitters, yeah, this is worth the cost of the money. And I believe in compensating people fairly for their labor. Or a piece like what Mike Williams did here with Dark Succubus. This is a piece that it deserves fair compensation. I mean, Mike did an amazing job on this cover. And if it wasn't for this cover, I wouldn't be able to put a strong cover on the book that would lead to a strong first impression, because when it comes down to a publisher, the things that are there, like the images on the book, this is part of a fixed cost. And you need it, because without this type of image, you're not going to be able to generate sales. So when it comes down to these kind of costs, again, they are worth paying for, and there's no way of getting around them. So, and when you're doing things like a comic, that can also affect your reputation, because you can go, oh, this comic by so-and-so, it's got so-and-so's art in it. I'm definitely going to go buy that, because it's a leader that gets people in. Whereas a no-name guy, yeah, his art could be nice, but then nobody's going to take a risk on it. So there's a lot of trade-offs as related to publishing comics. And again, those costs, sometimes you got to understand what the risks are. And that's one of the things that really saddened me about the fall of Vertigo, is that you had somebody who was in charge of Vertigo who didn't understand what was there, what needed, they appreciate the opportunity that was given to them, and appreciate what they were responsible for. They were all caught up in the idea of generating controversy to get sales, like they did on a website, not understanding that you were being blessed with a tremendous opportunity to run a comic book imprint, and to go out here and manage that imprint and make sure that it would be there as a place for other creators to be. But because your SJW Comics pros are selfish, they didn't really think about the opportunity they were blessed with, because they didn't appreciate it. And a lot of them, they felt entitled to the jobs that they had, not understanding that in publishing, you can have a job today and it's not there tomorrow. And you have to appreciate the job that's given to you, because if you can't generate sales, you're going to be out sooner rather than later. Because when it comes down to publishing, if your sales numbers aren't strong, you're not going to be around in the business much longer. What's up, Mass Panther? Mass Panther is one of my friends on Facebook, and I'm glad to see him here in the stream. And we were talking about the fall of Vertigo Comics, and it's rumored again that Vertigo is going to, as an imprint, is going to be shut down by Warner Brothers and DC Comics. And if that's the case, again, it's a really sad day for comics because we lost a major part of the industry that really shaped the way people read comics in the 90s. Now, many people, they're sitting there online and they're saying that, oh, good riddance to Vertigo. What's up, Omeo? Glad to see you here. And they're saying good riddance to Vertigo. But when I look at it from the whole perspective of what the imprint meant for the 27 years that it was in print, we have suffered a major loss as related to comics. We have really lost, a major imprint. And this is something people don't understand. They're thinking about the modern day 2018 SJW Vertigo and not thinking about the storied imprint and what it was worth. I think if Karen Berger were to come back, she would need autonomy from Dan Didio in order to really revive it. She would need to be pulled away from Dan Didio. I think the best thing for Warner Brothers would be to fire Dan Didio and just get through with it. But I believe if Karen Berger came back, she could have possibly revive it at that point, because a lot of people know Karen Berger as someone who's a visionary. They know her as somebody who's a strong leader. And I think she could revive it. And I think she buys him for life. I think she could do a great job with it. Because the big problem with Vertigo was they didn't have that leader to lead the imprint. They really didn't have that person there who could set that tone and direction. And that's what they needed for that type of brand. I mean, people want good comics. They want comics that tell great stories, comics that have really bold and dynamic art, and they want comics that are fun and fast paced. That's what people want, but we're not getting it. Hi, Ebony Brown, glad to see you here. But we're not getting that. And what they want to do is they hire the wrong people, and those wrong people wind up, doing damage to these brands and making it to the point where they're not functioning. Now, one of the fun things that I found is, like, a lot of people tell me that John Haynes is a lot like Constantine. And after Mike did the first cover for A Conversation with Death, it was a big hit. And I sometimes wonder if your Vertigo was to launch with a John Haynes, would it have done well? Because John Haynes' A Conversation with Death was a big seller for the SJS Direct imprint. And Dark Succubus is doing well right now. So I'm sitting there and I said to myself, and I've also put it on Twitter, I said, if we did John Haynes, would it have done well with Vertigo? And because it's just the type of book, it's just like Constantine to many people. And a lot of people who've read Constantine say it's just like it. So I often wonder if they were to have launched a Vertigo relaunch and they had a John Haynes in there, would they have had that hit? And again, that's all because that's something that could have happened if your DC and your Vertigo hadn't gone out here and gotten greedy. They could have had those type of books, and those kind of books like a John Haynes could have been something that could have gotten people back in the comics, because it's the kind of stories that are more appealing to casual readers, and it features content that explores different themes that you haven't seen before. So a lot of people, they would tell me, oh, John Haynes is like Constantine. And then I look at Vertigo and I said, if this is the kind of book people want, this is what they should have put into a Vertigo book. And we didn't get that type of book from Vertigo. We got books that just, you sit there, you look at them and they don't work together. I mean, how does Border Town tie in the Hex Wives, and how does High Level, which is about post-apocalyptic, tie into what's going on in the other two books? It just doesn't they don't come together and they don't give you that reason to pick up other titles. In fact, they're so different from each other that you just don't see the relationship between all of them. And they were just, again, they were filled with so much identity politics. It wasn't funny, and it wasn't even done well, to say the least. I mean, I've read, Border Town, and Border Town was absolutely terrible. It was just an unreadable mess, which was more about pushing identity politics than giving me the story of what was about this border town and these so-called chupacabras. We never got any story related to them. All we got was expository sequences talking about identity politics and social justice. Same thing with Hex Wives, which is supposed to be about witches, but was all about feminism, and it just really didn't give you that reason to go out here and buy the books. And the same thing with your High Level, which is supposed to be about this city, the High Level, but again, caught up in identity politics, you couldn't really get into it. And then you had the other book, which was about some type of biracial detective, but you couldn't get into it again because the authors and the artists were so in their feelings. The same thing with Goddess Mode, which was just a jumbled mess of a book. I mean, that art was just, Goddess Mode is it's an unreadable comic. And I believe even in the Karen Berger era, she would have given all of those books form letters and told those creators that they needed more time to work on their craft. They needed to work on their skills, and they really needed to go out here and work on their on things, because what I saw on that page wouldn't even meet my standard at the SJS Direct imprint for the term as related to quality art or as related to quality storytelling. And if somebody were to submit those comics to me, I would have had to have given those books a rejection, because they wouldn't be right as related to my mission, one, and two, I believe they wouldn't be right because it's clear to me from what was on the page that the creators just weren't ready for prime time. Because somebody who is ready for prime time, you can look at their art and it's clear. You can see the figures, the composition of the figures is clear. You can see the story being told in a single image, and that image is going to draw you in with the picture, and you're going to be able to figure out what's there. And as you read the words, you're going to come into that story, and it's going to compel you with that first page, and then you're going to want to go and read more of that comic. And by the time that person is finished with that comic, they are going to want to come in and buy that next issue and anticipate getting that next issue. So that's something I wasn't seeing in these Vertigo books as related to their content. And the 2018 relaunch, none of those books really did that job of getting you in to really buy that next book or generate that word of mouth. And when I look at the industry overall, we really need those kind of books. And you're finding them more and more on the independent circuit with books like T-Bird and Throttle, which, again, a book I highly recommend you guys pick up. Agent Solo, another book I highly recommend you pick up. And I'm hoping to have some more comics because I put in some more pledges for other comics. And there's a lot of great stuff out there, but it's not being produced by companies like your Vertigo. And again, what's really sad is companies that started everything like Vertigo and Milestone. These are companies that open the doors for different genres, open the doors for different customers. And sadly, these companies, they can't get it together. And they were the ones who invented a lot of the cool stuff and got people into comics, but they just can't get them together. And again, it's a real shame that Vertigo is going to be shut down. I'm gonna get ready to end the stream in about 6-7 minutes. So if anybody has any questions, you can give me a question and I'll try to answer it. But when I look at this Vertigo imprint again, I am just deeply disappointed to see it end on a whimper like this, because it's clear to me that the talent what they did as related to their business model is what led to their demise. And that demise, I believe, again, started in 2010 because Warner Brothers was more interested in making money than making great comics. And when you come into a business thinking about making money, then you're not going to make any great comics, because in order to make great comics, you need to go out here and have a business model that allows you to court great creators. What comics did you want to get? When it comes down to T-Bird and Throttle, you can get that on Josh Howard's website. I'm going to leave a link to that. You can get T-Bird and Throttle there, and you can get Agent Solo over at Indiegogo. I don't have the link for that one yet. Let me see if I can get it. You get Agent Solo on Indiegogo, and you can pick up my books. On Amazon.com. See if it's going to let me do it. Yeah, that's true, Bison for Life. I don't think it's going to last much longer with the big two, because they are in a bad place right now. Their sales are just not there. And when you have the numbers they have right now, they're just not strong. And in order to really get sales that are profitable, that allow you to cover all your costs, you have to sell at least about 100,000, 200,000 in the comic book business. And this is something I'm not seeing with comic book numbers these days. I mean, comic book numbers these days, sales numbers these days, look like KDP independent books on Amazon. I mean, there are Amazon books that sell better than most comic books these days. And that's one of the things that's really sad, is that we're not really seeing the numbers on comics like they used to be. And we're in the middle of a boom where superhero movies are selling at an all-time high. And even comic book properties, like a lot of Vertigo properties, are being turned into TV shows like iZombie and many of the other shows. And we're not seeing any of that financial success coming back to the comic shops like it did in '89 when Tim Burton's Batman was released. Because I remember being there in '89, and the comic shops got a lot of traffic when that movie came out. Yeah, I don't forget Lucifer, but Lucifer on Fox, he reminds me of Captain Save-Em, so I don't really talk about him too much, Supremo. But yeah, they have a Lucifer comic that was at Vertigo that was a classic. But it really goes in depth into the Lucifer Morningstar, but the way they did him on the show, he comes across as a simp. But there are a lot of great comics out there, and I do a lot of books. I do mostly prose fiction, but a lot of it is just like a comic, and a lot of people say that my stuff is just like comics. Um, but when it comes down to the big two, they don't really have the people in charge there that can really set that direction in editorial, and they really don't have the guidance that these young creators need towards building a career. And a lot of them think that they can just come into comics and do whatever they please. But what they don't understand is you are a business, you are a brand, and you represent your products whenever you go online. So when I came out with the SJS Direct Imprint, I understood that, I'm going to be the face of the SJS Direct Imprint, and I'm going to be the one who has to go out here and sell ISIS and Easteen and John Haynes to readers. And I'm going to have to go out here and put on the most professional face if I hope to sell lots of books. And I'm also going to have to put on a professional face if I hope to form a relationship with my readers, because it's that relationship that is going to really get readers to get to know me and want to support my work, because once they get to know who I am, that'll give them a reason to go out here and support the work. And when it comes down to your so-called SJW Comics pros, they're not coming at it from a business perspective. They are coming at the comics from their feelings. And if you approach comics from your feelings and believe you are just entitled to just create whatever you want, then you're not going to go out here and get the sales. Thank you very much, Ebony Brown. These are the books that are in the 2019 catalog. This just came out. It's John Haynes' Dark Succubus. And this is where the man who rules the world is tempted by a sultry succubus. This is Easteen, Goddess of, where Hell's aspiring angel takes on a demonic dominatrix. And this is Isis, All That Glitters, where the goddess next door takes on a bikini-clad bank robber. And I have other books in the SJS Direct Imprint. I just put a new cover on Isis, All About the Goddess, which is a mystery where the goddess next door takes on a campus stalker. So I have a lot of different titles, and you'll find some very compelling reads. I also do novels as well. So I put out a lot of different stuff. I have about over 60 titles right about now. And the whole thing that I'm looking at right now, again, I'll always get back to Batman 89, but Batman 89 really got people in the comic shops, and it got people selling comics in different places. I mean, it was the first time I actually started seeing comics in bodegas on the regular. I mean, people who never sold comics before were selling comics in 89, 90 after Batman 89. And people were getting excited about comics who never got excited about comics before. And that was something we didn't get to see, with the current superhero craze. We didn't really get to see people going out here and buying stuff like they did in 1989. 89, you saw so much merchandise. I mean, I bought quite a bit of it myself. I bought all the Toy Biz Batman figures, the Batcave, the Batmobile, the Batwing, and people were buying stuff like they were buying comics and on the regular, and it was something you never saw before. You just saw people who never bought comics buying comics, and it's something that I had a Batman shirt myself, Supremo. It was crazy out there. It was like totally crazy. I mean, summer '89, everything was Batman, and everybody was buying comics. Comic stores got a lot of traffic back then, and that was all because of the movie. And as you read the comics, everything just synergized because the Michael Keaton looked just like Jim Aparo's Batman at the time, and everything in the comics was pretty close to the movie. So, you bought all that stuff, Supremo. But yeah, I remember all that stuff. The movie adaptation. I remember the comic adaptation. I remember I even had a copy of they were reprinting the Golden Age Batman comic strips in the daily news magazine. And so it was all over the place when it came down to Batman 89. And that really, again, led to the foot traffic that got people coming into the comic shops. And it led to people who were older finding those books like Sandman. And that, again, led to the momentum of people coming into Vertigo to have the Vertigo imprint. So it led to the momentum that built into Vertigo. And we really got a lot of great stuff, out of that 89. So Vertigo, I believe it's like that was all leading into the momentum, which led into Vertigo becoming an imprint. And when it came down to Vertigo, it was, again, a place where we really got to see creators who in the 80s, we had a lot of creators like that. They were going to places like Fantagraphics at the time. That's where you had a lot of indie creators coming in. You had some coming into, I believe it was Now and First and Eclipse. There were a lot of different ones, but their primary focus was superheroes. But the other genre styles, usually you might get one here or there, like with Mike Allen Collins and Terry Beatty's Miss Tree, which was one of the mystery detective genre. They were out there, but they weren't like the primary focus of those imprints. They were all about superheroes, but we still really didn't get a real serious focus on it until Vertigo came along. And we really started to really see people really exploring these different genres and exploring a lot of those genres that came out in the 40s, but were wounding up suppressed due to the what were those I forget what it's called again, seduction of the innocent, and those congressional hearings, which really took comics and turned it into only superheroes for the next 25, 30 years, because a lot of people feared presenting content that would be considered offensive at the time. So I'm going to get ready to wrap the stream up right about now. I thank everybody for coming out to the stream, and I thank everybody for taking the time to spend time with me on this live stream. I plan on having another live stream Friday night at 10 o'clock. I'm still trying to figure out what the topic of that one is going to be. It might be something men's issues related, and but it's still up in the air. I would really appreciate it if everybody would go out here and support the books of the SJS Direct 2019 catalog: Isis, All That Glitters, Eve, Goddess of, and John Haynes' Dark Succubus. And if you could pick up John Haynes' A Conversation with Death and the other books of the SJS Direct imprint. All of those books are available on Amazon.com right now. And I'm going to wrap this stream up, and I'm hoping you guys pick up the books, and I'm hoping you'll be there for the stream coming up on Friday night.